Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 7, Language and Paradox in the School of Names. So this video lecture is going to be a little bit different than some of the others. The material here, if you've done the reading already, you'll see it's actually pretty different from the other stuff that we're doing. In a lot of ways, this is the kind of thing that you just benefit from most by just reading. It's dealing with a lot of weird issues about language and logic, and just having, the printed page right in front of you and following along is the best way to do that. And especially, for the quiz over this week, I'm really drawing very directly from the book, whether or not I kind of talk about some specific details in the lecture today. Follow along. I mean, a lot of the times I'm literally taking exact phrasing from the book. Sometimes it's paraphrased a little. You still got to think critically. Here I want to talk about kind of the broader picture, like what's going on with all of this weird stuff and why does it matter, I think. And in particular, I'm going to talk about this idea of conceptual clarification and how it's a central idea in philosophy, and that's what your discussion item will be over, and that's not really in the book. So make sure you're watching this video for the bigger picture stuff and what's going on with that, so that you can answer that question well. So to that end, let's sort of dive in here. And we'll start here with Dongxi and the origins of the school, Roman numeral 1 section in chapter 7, Dongxi. Write that on the board, why not? Good. So philosophy, we just have a few little snippets from the so-called School of Names. And as the textbook author points out, that's not, he always puts it in quotes because it's not really an organized movement the way, say, Confucianism is. It's a collective term that was retroactively given to a whole bunch of very different philosophers, but that are dealing with things like kind of weird little quirks and paradoxes with language, logic. Names is kind of a generic word that can sometimes just mean like kind of words and concepts, that kind of thing. So they're in a broad category even if they're not specifically related to a particular philosophical movement. And Dongxi is just kind of a nice little kickoff for that. There's a little story that he tells. This is apparently something that he had written where he talks about the Wei River. It's very great in size. A wealthy man drowned in it. Somebody retrieved his body. I'm not going to read this whole thing word for word here. And then the family wanted to buy it. And Dongxi apparently said, don't worry about it. He can't sell it to anybody else. I mean, who would buy body of somebody they weren't related to, right? But then the man who found it was sort of anxious, and Dongxi apparently said, don't worry about it, they'll be unable to buy it from anyone else. So it kind of led to this weird little paradoxical situation where it seems like, both of them have the upper hand, except neither of them really do, right? And according to the author, this illustrates a doctrine that Dongxi apparently advocated called both arguments are acceptable, by which he meant that either side of any position he claims can be defended equally well. So his idea is, if you've got a disagreement, a negotiation, a disagreement about philosophy or something, like anything at all, he seems to be claiming that you can actually give equally good arguments for any side of any issue. And that's a really interesting claim, and we see something, the textbook author talks about this a little bit. We see this with the ancient Greeks. There was a school, they were a formal school known as the Sophists. This down here. It's in your book, but just to use the whiteboard there. Which literally means like wise people, but it comes to have a negative connotation because Plato didn't like them and argued against them, and Plato wins that historical debate, apparently. So sophist comes to mean like a falsely wise person. If someone calls you a sophist, it's an insult. Right? Somebody who talks real well, but maybe doesn't really know anything. And the reason Plato characterized them that way is that they were kind of extreme relativists. They believed there was no such thing as objective or universal truth. It's all relative. It's all just opinion. So if there's no truth and only opinion, then there's no point in trying to find the truth with philosophy or logic. All we should really do is just make sure we give good arguments for our opinions in order to sway other people to take our opinions and act the way we want them to. So the Sophists trained politicians in ancient Greece so they could go into, the Athenian democracy and give speeches and sway people how to, to vote in the way that they wanted to, even if it was for perfectly selfish purposes, that truth, right and wrong, none of that really mattered for them. So Dongxi seems to have a similar view as the Sophists. Protagoras is one of the famous Sophists that is mentioned in the book there, and seems to have held a very similar argument. It's all relative. Man is the measure of all things. There's no objective truth. It's just human opinion, that kind of thing, right? And so this is just a kind of a nice example of the sort of thing that we're talking about here with this school of names. Somebody who seemed to delight in coming up with these weird little paradoxical situations and then making these kind of interesting claims about them. And it's interesting too, like it's so different than what we've studied before, where all the emphasis has been on like ethics and political philosophy. And those sort of things, I think it's obvious to people why those are relevant, right? Everybody has to be like in a society and deal with other people and think about how to live their lives. But when you read this kind of philosophy, sometimes it's understandable if you read this and think like, so what? This just seems like weird little word games. What's the point? But I think as we'll see as we go along, especially as we get into the later figures in the School of Names, that what's going on is an attempt to actually kind of take a step back from specific like ethical and political issues and think about the nature of language and argumentation more, and try to engage in a process in philosophy that we call conceptual clarification. And I'll talk more about that as we go along, especially towards the end of the video. I'll have a little mini lecture over this idea, something to think about for your discussion. Excuse the video if there's an extra number of little jump cuts. I'm doing this in little bits and pieces because I'm also doing a million other things today, and I'm like running into the office, recording 5 or 10 minutes, zapping out to a meeting, that kind of thing. It'll be a little jarring there, I suppose, right? But I'll try to do it section by section, so it's good to take some little mini breaks, grab some coffee or something. So section 2 here, we talk about Hui Shi. So another important philosopher from this school of names, group of people, a statesman, a politician, fairly successful until towards the end where you can read how things didn't go so well. And what we have of him are these 10 theses. Right? Thesis is a claim of some kind, philosophically speaking. Right? It can be used in other ways in other disciplines and such. And again, this is a good thing to just read. I don't want to read or write these all 1, 2, 3, 4 through 10 on the board here. But you can see he has these 10 different claims, and we don't really know what he had in mind because that's kind of all we have. We don't have him elaborating on these. And so we have to interpret what these mean, and the textbook author gives some fairly reasonable interpretations. Some of your quiz questions are about that. Again, just kind of get your book out and read through it a bit. He points out the first couple seem like these sort of spatial paradoxes. Maybe that's a strong word, but things that seem a little conceptually odd, right? And so, again, you can read these on your own, but just to pick out a few examples, the first two being spatial paradoxes. Number 2 is kind of interesting, right? That which has no thickness cannot be accumulated, yet it can be 1,000 leagues large. So that seems like a paradox, right? If you got this something that has no width to it whatsoever, it doesn't matter how many you put next to each other, it seems like you would still have nothing, and yet somehow can be 1,000 leagues large. Well, what's going on there, as the textbook author suggests, what we have is some mathematical concepts, things like lines and points, right? So a line could be 1,000 leagues large, and we say, kind of colloquially, it's made up of points, right? In the sense that you could identify points at any point on the line. But then that does lead to a weird paradox. If you think of a point as an actual spatial location that has some physical existence, and yet you're told it has no width whatsoever, you think, well, how can a long line be made up of infinitesimally small things, right? Not just small, but really kind of no width, like 0 whatsoever, right? But yet that's exactly what we do in modern mathematics. And we think about that, it's so intuitive for us, but people thousands of years ago had to come up with these kind of mathematical concepts. And we do have writings from different cultures. Even the ancient Greeks wrestled with this and came up with what they thought were mathematical problems that turned out like, they were still thinking of a point as though it has just a little bit of width, and that was incorrect. And then later, ancient Greek philosophers like Euclid, he is somebody you hopefully has studied in math classes. He came up with this first really rigorous system of geometry in the Western world. And it's still a kind of a basic geometry you learn today. There are non-Euclidean forms of geometry that you have to apply when things get weird in physics, quantum physics or galactic scales. But this is, thousands of years later, still very good everyday geometry. Like you can use Euclidean geometry and stuff that people have kind of built onto it when you have a carpentry project or something. Google Euclid's Elements. And you'll see it starts off with things that kind of look like these theses. It's just basically a list of definitions where he defines things like lines and points and planes and all that kind of stuff. And he has to do that in order to then build geometry. And then, imagine a world without geometry. I mean, we just wouldn't be able to do anything, build anything, calculate anything, right? So it seems like a weird little thing to say, but he's trying to come up with some very basic mathematical concepts, and it turns out they're actually pretty accurate. It's interesting, right? Most of the rest of them, especially like 3 through 9, deal with so-called paradoxes of perspective. So something like, heaven and earth are equally low, mountains and marshes are on the same level. At the moment the sun is at its highest, it's setting. At the moment something is born, it is dying. I left for you today, but arrived yesterday. Again, these seem like kind of weird little paradoxical claims. But what's going on there is he's pointing out that many terms don't have some objective meaning. They're relative terms. High and low don't refer to objective places. You're always high relative to some perspective, or low relative to some perspective. So something can, in fact, be both high and low, depending on the perspective you're looking at, right? So a spot, 20 feet above the ground is kind of high if I'm trying to reach a weird shelf or something. But it's very, very low if you're at the top of a skyscraper and you don't want to fall all that way, right? And so this is important too. It's kind of for conceptual clarification, which again, I'll talk about in a little more detail. But the idea that we have to be careful when we're using certain terms. Do they actually refer to something objective, or do we mean them relative? In which case, whether or not they're true can actually kind of depend on your perspective, and that's something to be clear about. And where a lot of that perspectivism is really interesting is in that very last claim, the 10th thesis. Indiscriminately care for the myriad things. Heaven and earth are one whole. This seems to be more like an ethical and maybe political claim about how we interact with people, maybe how we should run societies. And especially because it comes last after all these other things that talk about perspective, it sort of implies that perspective, maybe some kind of relativism, not unlike the sophists, should be used as a guide for our living our lives and interacting with other people. So it does seem like an ethical claim. And this one in particular, kind of hang on to this thought, because I think in some ways it's at the heart of some of the other philosophies that we're going to look at, especially as we get into Lao Tzu and Chuang-Tzu and some later chapters. Chuang-Tzu in particular seems to take this perspectivism very seriously when it comes to ethics and politics and things like that. So these aren't all just totally weird little abstract, I'm dealing with mathematical things, that they do seem to have some ethical or political implication that other philosophers will take up and use to argue for their different theories, their actual schools of thought. Right? And also, just the last thing that the textbook author mentions, a lot of the ones may not seem like it, but they could also be very subtle political analogies. So talking about, the South is inexhaustible yet exhaustible, right? I mean, that sort of suggests compass directions mapping, and so thinking about different nations and how they interact with one another. There are, you can study this in some of your social science classes and geography classes. There are sometimes weird, subtle political implications of things like mapping. Like the fact that we always put north on the top of a map instead of south. Why? We could flip it around. That would be just fine, right? Why is it that the world maps always seem to have England in the center? Could be England and Western and Europe drew a lot of the early versions of those maps and they thought they were the center of the world and all of civilization, right? So you can flip maps, you can like move things around and they'd still be perfectly accurate. But it's weird, man, if you've ever seen those like flipped maps where they do some of that stuff and the names are right side up so you can read it. I don't just mean take a map and flip it up. It's weird, it hurts your brain to look at because you're so used to thinking of it a certain way. Good. So a lot of this stuff, it's sort of conceptual clarification about relativism, perspectivism, that has some political implications and some general philosophical implications that we will see as we move on. Jump cut. All right, I'm back. So let's look at the next section here. This is section 3, Hong Sum Long, which I'm probably not pronouncing super authentically, but doing my best. And this one, it's only like three pages here, 3.5 pages, but read this very carefully. This is one where you're just reading is so much better than trying to listen to somebody explain it. But it comes down to this idea of the On the White Horse dialogue, which is a reading that we have for a selection that we have of his writings. Not we in the class, but I mean like we as in civilization, right? Some of the things that, they wrote, we only kind of know secondhand, but we have this dialogue. And in particular, it's these two people arguing about a certain claim. A white horse is not a horse. And arguing whether this is true or false, right? So this seems kind of weird, right? This claim, it seems like it has to be true or false. Which one is it? And then they, again, you can kind of read the details, but they give these different arguments back and forth, right? Now, again, it's easy to read this stuff and think, wow, this is just a bunch of like weird kind of wordplay, and it's just kind of annoying. Maybe they're a bunch of sophists like Plato criticized, right? But what's interesting is that, again, we're kind of dealing with some fundamental concepts that really do have to be clarified before we can do other things like, say, contemporary mathematics. And so especially things like set theory, if you've learned any of that in your math classes, if you've ever studied Venn diagrams in a logic class, and those come up in math sometimes too, that seems to be what's going on here. And so at least one interpretation is that what he's doing is deliberately writing this in a way where the two people arguing are actually getting kind of tripped up by some ambiguity of the language, and they've got different interpretations in mind, and maybe they're kind of talking past one another. Possible interpretation, right? In English, this is interesting because like part of the problem here is this word a, such a little word that we use all the time. It's sort of grammar class. I don't know how much of this you remember specifically, but we use words like a and the, right? They're called articles. And a is the indefinite article, and the is the definite article. And when you try to explain, not all languages have articles, by the way. Classical Chinese, I don't believe, did. And when you try to teach someone English as a second language when they come from a language that doesn't have articles, it's really hard to explain what those mean, right? Have you thought about trying to define the word a or the word the recently? Probably not. But if you're a native speaker, you use it all the time without any problem. And sometimes people will say, well, the like points out a specific thing where a, that we call it the indefinite article because maybe it just sort of refers to any possible thing. But that's not actually true in context. So like a can be used in a general way. Like if I say, a cat has 4 legs, I'm talking about like, all cats. That's true or false. Most of them do, right? But I can also use it in a very specific way, like, look, there's a cat right now walking across the driveway, right? So these are really weird words. They're weirder than you give them credit for. And so some of the ambiguity seems to be in that. When he's saying a white horse, does he mean sort of like, the group of white horses in general, or is he thinking like a specific white horse? The other thing that's kind of interesting in it is this term is. It's another one of those tiny little things. It's a linking verb, right? It's really hard to explain exactly what that means. And it turns out it can actually mean different things in different contexts. So sometimes is kind of functions like the language equivalent of an equal sign in mathematics, that you're saying, whatever's on either side of the word is, that those are identical to one another. But other times you can use the word is to say, well, they're not identical, but this is a kind of a member of this larger group of things. So if I say, a dog is a canine, that seems to be the equal sign, right? Those two different names for the same thing, right? But if I say a dog is a mammal, I'm not saying those are equal, right? Because all dogs are mammals, but not all mammals are dogs, so they are different concepts. But I'm saying that dogs sort of belong to the group of mammals. And that's just a couple of the different ways that the word is can be used, right? So again, maybe there's some conflict there as well. What the author suggests is that there is this kind of ambiguity, and he uses some mathematical symbolization from like set theory and whatnot, which is kind of fun. But another way to think about it is to think in terms of what are called Venn diagrams. And so the circles kind of represent sets, just kind of like the mathematical sets, but a little bit more graphical representation. And so the one on the left could be the group of all things that are white, just white things of any kind, right? And the group on the left could be a group of all horses. And where they overlap would be anything that is both white and a horse. In other words, a white horse, right? And so that's where it gets kind of weird. When you say a white horse is not a horse, is that true or false? It kind of depends on what you mean. So if you have a specific horse in mind that is white, that you're pointing out, on a Venn diagram you would indicate that with like a little X. And if it's a white horse, it would have to fall in this area that overlaps, right? You're saying this thing is both white and a horse, right? Over here we have white things only. Over here we have horses only, right? This is where you have the white horses, right? Or you say over here you have things that are white but not horses because it's outside that overlap there, right? And then same over here, right? But not white. And this is where they're both, right? So on a Venn diagram, a white horse, if by that you mean there is a particular white horse, and you're saying it's not a horse, well then that's just false, right? A white horse goes there, and that is in the category of horses. Horses can be white or not white, right? On the other hand, they might be saying that the whole class of white horses is not identical to the whole class of horses in general. And then that seems to be true, right? That this here, this middle part, that's the part that is white horses. Whereas this whole right circle is the part that is horses in general, and those are not identical, right? This is actually just a subset of that. So that kind of goes back to that is thing I talked about before, right? A dog is a canine in the sense that it's part of that subset. But dog doesn't equal canine, because not all canines are dogs. So these are just a couple of ways. It's not exactly how the textbook author talks about it, but it shows, what again I'm going to talk about in more detail, this idea of conceptual clarification. And this does have important ethical and political implications, that sometimes people in political debates, it turns out they're actually talking past one another because they haven't taken a time to step back and really clarify what it is they're saying. And sometimes the simplest of words like a or is can be really, really misleading, and you've got to take a step back and say, here's exactly what I mean by that. This is not what I mean by that. Okay, so let's see if we can kind of home stretch some of the stuff here on the next few sections. The later Mohis has a lot of subdivisions. We can kind of do that in once. Again, this is one where I just say, read very carefully. Especially the test questions are based on, like, I'm literally lifting some phrases from the texts. So use that especially while you're doing that. Again, those, tests, the quizzes, they're not timed and they're open book. Just have your book and do that kind of stuff, right? But just to kind of point out some of the important things. So he talks about the later Mohists. We've talked about Mohism already. They hung around for a while. As we said, there aren't really contemporary thinkers that call themselves Mohists, but for a while there's some early and later Mohists. And we talked about how they were really important because they helped develop the idea of argumentation in reaction to Confucianism, which at least appeared not to have a lot of that. And so a lot of these things about, arguments, paradoxes, etc. were of interest to them, but also concerns because they did want to be able to have good objective arguments for things and not just kind of play with language or feel like it ended up being unresolvable paradoxes, right? And so, he talks about the paradox here in section 1 of, it's Roman numeral 4, the later Mohists, right? And then section 1, resolving the paradox of Dongzhi. And there's a bit of very nice conceptual clarification, which I keep mentioning, and we'll talk about a bit more, where they're focusing on this thesis of Dongzhi that says that both arguments are acceptable, and they point out that that's kind of ambiguous as well, can be interpreted different ways, and they might agree or disagree depending on the particular interpretation, right? And so, he walks you through 3 options here, right? If you're saying neither side of an argument is the correct one, then they'd say, well, it depends. Like, sometimes both people can be wrong, and in those cases, that's just fine. But in other cases, maybe both people can be right, like more than one statement can be true. If we call something, and I call it a dog, and you call it a canine, we're both right. We're just using different words. They kind of are different claims in a sense, but they're saying the same thing in different ways, right? And then on other occasions, we could both be wrong. If we're looking at a dog and one person says it's a horse and one says it's an ox, then we're both wrong, right? But then sometimes one person can be right and one person can be wrong. I say it's a dog, you say it's a horse, well then I'm right and you're wrong. If they're saying that every statement is true and no statement is false, right, then, well, their idea is that it's actually self-contradictory to deny that some statements are false. And then there's a paragraph here you can read in detail. If they say, if by that they mean every statement is self-contradictory, and again, they say that's also wrong because it's self-contradictory itself, right? So again, it's something in this little passage you can read the ins and outs. But the important idea is that they'd say, the statement's kind of vague, we need to clarify it, and then it might be right or wrong, kind of depending on how you clarify it and what sort of situations you're applying it to. Also, they talk a little bit about in the next section there, number 2, resolving the paradoxes of Hui Shi. They say a lot of those things look paradoxical but might not be, which, as we suggested before, might have been what Hui Shi meant in the first place, that he's sort of getting us to think about things that sound sort of paradoxical. And they bring up the idea that there are certain terms that are inherently perspectival or relative, but that doesn't mean there's no right or wrong about something. Right, so they do that with words like this and that. Those are what are called demonstrative pronouns. Right? And so the word this could refer to more than one thing, depending on what you point at. So too for that. We often use this for something nearer and that for something farther. So I might call something this, and you standing over there might call it that. But that could both be correct or incorrect, depending on how we're applying them, right? So, just maybe another example, something like left and right. I can both be on the left and the right, depending on what it's to the left or the right of, right? One object rather another. But then if I say I'm to the left of this and I'm to the right of that, that could be true or false, depending on what the this or the that are. Right? Resolving the white horse paradox, kind of similar to what we talked about. It depends on what you mean by that, right? So if you're talking about like the group of white horses, and whether that's a subset of the group of horses, rather than, talking about whether they're identical to one another, right? So again, they seem to say that as well, right? That it's actually acceptable to say that either one can be true, but you have to clarify what each of those are. And then in section 4, the new foundation of Mohist ethics, this is where, all that weird abstract, I seem to be playing with language and arguments, becomes really productive when it gets back to things like ethics and politics, because that showed the Mohists maybe sometimes we need to be clearer so that people don't misunderstand us, think that we're being contradictory. And then, on page 114 and 115, they start to lay out this much more kind of analytic style of ethics where they're clearly defining their different terms, so you understand what something means and what it doesn't mean, right? And then be able to give definitions for things like, caring, benevolence, righteousness, and then be able to have much clearer arguments against the Confucians about what those things actually mean. Right? So that's an important point there. It seems like people are just kind of playing little word games, but it helps you clarify concepts and then just develop the general critical thinking skills, the general kind of argumentation and logical skills, which then you can take and bring back to important subjects. I always find that interesting because, I mean, I think that goes to part of the point of philosophy itself. A lot of the times I know students will say, oh, you know, you're arguing about something that doesn't really have a right answer. I mean, maybe, but that's not what we're really interested in. We're interested in developing our powers of argumentation and then taking it into the world and using it for things that really actually matter, right? We have all those abstract debates about the nature of fate and free will and so forth. Like, maybe it turns out we're never going to have a perfect answer for whether free will exists. I'm actually kind of okay with that. But now I've learned how to think and speak better, so I can talk about, you know, the latest political hubbub that's going on, right? Section 5 talks about the limits of logic. Again, this is something you can kind of read on your own a little bit. But it kind of shows different ways that philosophers have tried to spell out different ideas and arguments in a much more clear and systematic way, to the point where some philosophers have actually developed very formal systems of logic where things can be like symbolized with variables and operators and things like that. But not all philosophers necessarily do that, and the Mohists didn't. They didn't get to that level of formal logic. But I think what he points out is that that's okay, and even in the Western tradition, even within the last, you know, century or so, you get a lot of, in the Western world, especially in like Britain and America in the 20th century, there's this movement to try to make philosophy more like math and symbolic logic, and that every little argument has to be written with symbols and things. But even within that tradition, there were people who pushed back against that pretty hard and said, you know what, natural language is just fine. You just sometimes have to stop and be clearer about things and maybe define your terms, maybe clear up some ambiguities about what you mean by a and is. We don't need to put things into like mathematical proof format. And he gets into that a bit with the historical significance. It's really interesting to me that he points out within classical Chinese philosophy, most of the philosophers reacted kind of negatively to what the School of Names was doing and said, that's all just nonsense, don't think about it. Like Confucianism really didn't get into that and said, let's just focus on real world issues. But then, you know, it's interesting, in the Western tradition, we've always liked that kind of stuff, and just for those reasons, that it helps us develop critical thinking skills. And so just to kind of wrap that up, I mean, this critical thinking skill that I keep talking about in terms of conceptual clarification, if you've had me for intro to philosophy, my kind of more generic intro to philosophy, you've heard some of this before. When we talk about philosophy, and especially in an intro to philosophy class, a very generic intro to philosophy as a discipline, I haven't tried to define philosophy and how it differs from, you know, biology or English literature or something. And one of the things that I say about it is that, in a way, it's not really a subject matter the way those other disciplines are, so much as it's a collection of critical thinking methods. And first and foremost among those is one that I refer to as conceptual clarification. Now, what philosophers do, and have always done, and especially, you know, in the Western tradition that I'm very well versed in because of my, you know, background in grad school, which is mostly Western, you can see this really explicitly. I think it's still there in Eastern traditions. It's not always super explicit, and you have to tease it out a little like we did with Confucius. But all the way back, certainly at least to Plato, conceptual clarification seemed to be the central activity. And what philosophers do is they find concepts that are really important, but often not well understood, and try to clarify those concepts so we can ask better questions, clearer questions, and have more productive conversations about them. Plato in particular, he wrote a whole bunch of different books, and most of them will center on a kind of central conceptual clarification question. So one of Plato's most famous books is called Republic. It's a kind of work of political philosophy. And it's all about this issue, what is justice? The whole thing is devoted to conceptual clarification of this important political virtue, justice. And he spends, like in a modern book, 300 pages trying to define this term. And that's a way to think of conceptual clarification, to try to come up with good definitions for things, but not those kind of shallow, quick dictionary definitions, like really full, substantial definitions that will allow us to have productive philosophical conversations about them. And this isn't just abstract stuff. I mean, this comes up in various contexts. In real world, religious debates, for example, right? Somebody might ask a philosopher, do you believe in God? Well, the philosopher's going to take a step back and say, well, wait, get clear, what do you mean by God? Because if we're talking about, the ancient Greek polytheism, Zeus and Apollo, well, maybe not. Are you talking about modern Western monotheism, that there's this one perfect being? Maybe, and then we can have some conversations about that. This comes up in the law, too, quite a bit. Many lawyers have a background in philosophy. Law school is one of the main destinations for people who major in philosophy. And a lot of issues, like the law, has to be settled by doing some of this conceptual clarification, and that's why often it goes to, say, the Supreme Court, because that's really what they're arguing there. There's a fairly famous case, and of course I'm very bad with very specific details. Google it and you'll find it, I'm sure. I want to say it was back in the 60s or something, in Ohio somewhere maybe, where there was this guy who owned a movie theater, and he showed this, I think it was some foreign film, and it had some nudity in it, and the town council fined him $10,000 for showing pornography. Well, his claim is that this wasn't pornography, it was art, and therefore protected by the First Amendment, and therefore he couldn't, be sued for that. And it actually went all the way up to the national level Supreme Court. And what it came down to is, how do we define terms like art? How do we define pornography? In other words, conceptual clarification. They were looking for good working definitions of those ideas in order to try to determine whether or not this particular movie fit the category. In this case, it was kind of interesting because the Supreme Court as a whole sort of declined to come up with some perfect definition of pornography. One of the most famous quotes from this case, and you might have heard this or variations on this, is, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. Which, first of all, is kind of funny if you think about it. But second of all, is philosophically interesting. Can you know what something is if you can't clearly define it? I know my English teachers in school always said you can't use a word unless you can define it. Maybe that's false. Maybe I can use it just fine without defining it. What they all agreed is that under any reasonable definition of pornography, the movie didn't really meet that standard. It was just, I think it was something where there was just some mild nudity, and the town council kind of overreacted, right? So they at least kind of narrowed it down to some possible definitions, and then said, well, for legal purposes, it doesn't meet any of those, and therefore we don't really need to keep arguing about it to figure out the right one. But the art thing too, I mean, that comes up a lot because sometimes the government might have subsidies or grants available to artists, and they have to determine, is this thing that they're presenting, is it art or not? And sometimes they say, that's not art, you're just looking for a handout. Other times they say, yeah, it's art, but it's just kind of weird and new and maybe pushes our understanding of it a little bit, right? So conceptual clarification, kind of finding important concepts, clarifying them so we can ask better questions, have more productive conversations. That really seems to be what's at the heart of the School of Names. To me, they're being deliberately playful and paradoxical to get us to engage in some conceptual clarification. Because a lot of the times these things might seem paradoxical, but once you clarify them, maybe they're not so paradoxical after all, right? So that's something I'm going to want you to talk about that in the discussion. What is conceptual clarification as I've discussed it? What are some examples that I use? And then give some examples of your own where conceptual clarification could be relevant, helpful, in society at large, in your job, in a school, in class that you're taking, other than this one where it's obviously relevant, that kind of thing, all right? Okay, so that's my lecture for that again. Unlike some of the others, I didn't want to go through point by point. It's all right there, and it's very well organized. Read it, have your book with you when you do the quiz. I just wanted to hit the bigger picture of why the hell are we talking about this weird stuff? And as we'll see, it becomes relevant as we continue on to the next chapters, where we're going to see some of these paradoxes, the conceptual clarification, possibly some relativism and perspectivism, have some real-world effects on the kind of ethical and political doctrines that get advanced. All right, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions. Get to your assignments, and then we'll do our usual thing.